welcome to whatever we're calling ourselves. We still are not sure what our stream name is, but we'll think of something, or a channel name. We'll think of something later. On to more important issues. We want to deal with the issue of abortion today. And we want to maybe frame the discussion in a way that is not often, it's not often framed. And so there's this philosopher named John T. Noonan, Jr., and he has an article named An Absolute Value in History. And I think he poses an interesting question and how we, maybe an interesting approach in how we should ask the question. And he says, when we're dealing with the question of abortion, we should put it into the question of humanity. So how do you determine the humanity of a being? And he goes on to say, this is to put it in sort of more comprehensive terms, or maybe we could say humanistic terms. And we're putting into humanistic terms what the theologians either dealt with as an explicitly theological question, oftentimes under the heading ensoulment, or they dealt with implicitly in their treatment of abortion. And this Christian position did not originate from a narrow theological or philosophical concept, nor did it appeal to any sort of instantaneous ensoulment. Rather, it took the world's view on ensoulment from Aristotle, and it developed from that. And certainly theology influenced the theory of ensoulment, and it became more of a theological topic later on, so that it was always explained in theological terms. And this is often how people think about the abortion debate today. Religion versus, or the religious versus the non-religious, right? But if we can translate this idea of ensoulment into more humanistic language by substituting the term human for rational soul in Aristotle's idea, we can maybe reframe the problem. And the problem of knowing when a human is common to theology and humanism, not just theology. So we don't run into the problem of when does the fetus have a soul? Rather, we ask, when does the fetus become a human? Or when is a human, right? So if we then step outside the theological categories used by theologians, we can sort of rephrase why they thought abortion was abhorrent. And it can be said something like this. They refuse to discriminate among human beings on the basis of varying potentialities. So what Tony and I want to do is sort of look at some of these varying potentialities and see if they are appropriate, maybe appropriate distinctions to make in the abortion debate. So this refusal to discriminate among humans on the basis of their varying potentialities is important for our argument here. What we're going to say is once a human is conceived, the being was recognized as a human, or is recognized as a human, because they have human potential. So the criterion for humanity in history, it was always pretty simple. If you were conceived by human parents, you were a human. If you weren't, then you're not a human. And so the strength of this position can obviously be tested, right? And we can people have offered different distinctions in the contemporary debate over abortion, but perhaps the most popular one is viability. So that's the one that we want to start with before we jump into other lesser known distinction.
Yeah, so I guess like the main point about like viability that we want to start off with is essentially that the fetus is completely dependent upon the mother to survive. And so the argument kind of goes like, since the fetus is completely dependent upon someone else, if that's taken away, then that kind of proves that it's not really essentially human, because the idea of being human is that you're not completely dependent upon another life source because you're viable enough yourself as a human being.
Right. Right. And for our question too, since we're kind of putting it in terms of how do you determine the humanity of a being, like you're saying, right? If we want to say that the determining factor or the determining potentiality is viability, then you're right. The dependence is the basis of denying recognition to its humanity. So that becomes problematic. And obviously this leads to lots of difficulties, right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, basically a lot of stuff's not viable anymore. I mean, the most easy example for me personally is just regular children, like a 1-month-old. What is a 1-month-old doing without its parents? In what way is it surviving? It will die. It has to be constantly taken care of. I mean, in the olden world, we didn't have like artificial powders to make breast milk, the mother had to feed the child. There was no other way for the child to survive. So the mother was still having to use her body to take care of the child.
Even if they had powder, it's not like the child's going to go around mixing its own breast milk.
Right, exactly. So you have to exclude all children outside the womb on that argument as well.
Right. Yeah, probably up to like 3 or 4 years old even. I mean, it's pretty crazy.
And then a certain amount of Siamese twins would be excluded. Like sometimes you can't be separated.
Yeah.
Or you die, you wouldn't be able to survive. So Siamese twins are subhuman now. They're not really truly human beings because they're completely dependent. Not all Siamese twins, but there's some who have like their heads stuck together and it's like impossible.
Yeah, and I think you're making a good point. Really, it's just dependence is not ended by viability, right? So even like let's say the fetus is viable, and or they just give birth, and obviously the child is still going to be dependent, right? So you have viability, but you also have dependence. So it seems to me we can't make this distinction. We can't make this the distinction for determining humanity, or even personhood. But that's kind of a different question we're not addressing right now. But at the very least, we have this dependence is not ended by viability. And I like the example of Siamese twins, and you can multiply these examples too, right? I mean, even older, like people who are in nursing homes or have severe dementia, Alzheimer's, right? Do they lose their humanity because of these things?
Yeah, if you fall unconscious and you're stuck in an ambulance because you're bleeding out, now you're no longer a human being because you're dependent upon the healthcare workers.
Right.
It's pretty absurd when you actually start to break it down and think about it. But.
And even the perfection of artificial incubation as we get further along with our technology, right? Even Noonan, who's writing, I think in the 1970s, they already had artificial incubation that could make animal or experiments with animals were already showing that is possible to have a previously non-viable fetus from an animal now viable outside the womb, right? So at what point with our advancement in technology are we just going to keep pushing that back? So it's kind of a tough question to base viability on. And there's also research. This might be controversial, and I'm not super familiar with this research, but different racial groups have different ages at which their fetuses are viable. So it would be weird to make viability dependent, or it's a different standard for every race, I guess. Because then eventually we'd have to say, well, what about people? I mean, even for individuals, it varies from person to person. So it becomes a tough conversation to have.
Yeah.
And I guess the conclusion would be the unsubstantial lessening in dependence at viability, right? So even though it's viable, there's still a large amount of dependence, as you were showing with the children. That doesn't seem to signify any special granting of humanity just because you are now less dependent or something like that.
Right.
So I wouldn't want to base humanity on that sort of potentiality. Okay, so viability is one sort of distinction that's offered in the debate. Another one I hear often, and actually Noonan covers this one too, is the claim that humanity, the formation of humanity, depends on experience. That the fetus is unformed in the most basic human sense because it hasn't had the most basic human experiences of life, maybe loving, suffering, doesn't have any memories, anything like that. So what do you think? What do you think about this claim?
Yeah, you'd have to define specifically what experiences you would need to become a human being. Like, do you have to have a certain amount of memories? Like, how many experiences of love, et cetera, do you need to have until it's sufficient to be a human? And also, like, a fetus does have experiences, though. It's not like they don't experience anything. So it almost seems like the argument needs to be that you need to be cognizant of your experiences. Yeah, but then that kind of brings us back to the viability problem because there's lots of people who are not cognizant of their experiences.
Right.
So
Right. There
Yeah.
that yeah, I think, we're putting it in humanistic terms, but I can't help think about the um jumping for joy in the womb in scripture, right? Like you're
Hmm.
responding to a voice. There's also, I mean, there are studies that show that, like you said, the embryo is responsive to touch
Hmm.
after, what is it, 6, 7, 8 weeks, something like that. And then
Yeah.
even the zygote is alive and it responds to its environment. So there are studies being done on this that even if we want to make the dividing line experience, it does seem like it still applies to the fetus, even the zygote. Um, but I think more interesting is the point that you're making is at what point do we cut off the experience to say that's not enough experience? You haven't had this experience, right? Um, there is not really clear what experience would confer humanity or give someone more humanity than someone else. Um, so I don't know. I don't know if we want to link experience and humanity. Now, experience certainly can lead to wisdom, not always, but it seems weird to say it's linked to humanity itself.
Right. Because like, what if you have Alzheimer's and your memory doesn't work very well?
Right. Yeah.
Now, if you make memory a essential factor to being human, experientially speaking, if you have some sort of memory loss problem, then you're less human now.
Right. Right. Has it erased a part of your humanity or something like that? Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
and then you have like different states of memory, right? So,
Yeah.
I mean, there's that weird study that was done how you only have if you're drunk and you like study something, you can remember it better in the same state of memory of drunken memory. So it's just like, okay, well, which one's more human, right?
Yeah, yeah,
So,
that's a good point.
but really, the important distinction I think we want to get here, or the important point we want to talk about is that this distinction of experience leaves even the older fetuses or even younger children to be treated as less human, right? They're still
Yeah,
unformed, they're still
right.
inhuman.
Good point.
Or maybe, if someone is raised, I'm trying to think of that girl who was like raised in the woods by wolves. You know what I'm talking about?
I don't think so.
Okay, maybe I'll
But it
look that
sounds
up.
interesting.
Yeah, yeah. But okay, so you have these stories of people who are kidnapped, and
Hmm.
they basically live their life in the basement
Hmm.
of this creep, right? And they don't
Hmm.
really experience much. We want to say that they are less human because they have less experience, right? So it leads to all these absurd conclusions, which I think they just lead to problems for saying, oh well, humanity has to be based in experience. So those are just a couple potentialities people might use to try and say, okay, well, this is the line that I'm drawing in the sand for whether or not someone's a human or has humanity. And we've kind of shown that those don't work. There are a lot of them out there, but those are two of the more common ones. But there is this famous paper by Judith Jarvis Thomson, and she essentially says that most of the opposition to abortion relies on the premise that the fetus is a human being, a person from the moment of conception. And that's sort of what we're arguing, right? That there's this humanity. We're reframing the question: how do you determine the humanity of a being? And our answer is sort of, well, if you have human parents, then you have human potential, and so you're a full human, even if it's potentially. And so the she Dr. Thompson kind of says the premise is argued for, but she doesn't think it's argued for well. And she says this is the most common argument. We're asked to notice that the development of a human being from conception through birth into childhood is continuous. Then it is said that to draw a line, to choose a point in this development and say, before this point, the thing is not a person. After this point, it is a person, is to make an arbitrary choice, a choice for which, in the nature of things, no good reason can be given. And then it is concluded that the fetus is, or anyway, that we had better say it is, a person from the moment of conception. And that's a pretty good summary of a pro-life stance or anti-abortion stance. And
Hmm.
we kind of framed it in a similar regard, right? Talking about humanity, where do you how do you determine the humanity of a being? And she goes on to say, but this conclusion does not follow. Similar things might be said about the development of an acorn into an oak tree, and it does not follow that acorns are oak trees or that we had better say they are. And so this is sort of the position that I wanna address. This analogy he's using from the oak tree acorn to the oak tree. And later on, she even says, I'm inclined to agree that the prospects for drawing a line in the development of the fetus look dim. And so she doesn't want to draw a line in the development of the fetus, but she wants to raise doubt that there is a line of connection between the fetus and personhood, or the fetus and an adult, and that personhood is this line, right?
Right.
And so she ends up agreeing in her paper, right? For the purpose of this paper, she's going to say that the fetus is a person by conception, but she still goes on to say, I think that the premise is false, that the fetus is not a person from the moment of conception. A newly fertilized ovum, a newly implanted clump of cells, is no more a person than an acorn is an oak tree. And then she says, but I shall not discuss any of this. But I want to discuss it, and I want to talk a little bit about why she's wrong about that statement. So a lot of people will respond to the violinist argument in Thomson's paper. But I think this idea of potentiality is more interesting. So we kind of set up the question, right? What or how do you determine the humanity of a being? And then we can say, well, the early theologians, the early philosophers, and people in general just refuse to discriminate among human beings on the basis of varying potentialities. And viability is a potentiality, experience is a potentiality. And so now we have this sort of idea that Thomson's not going to use any sort of potentiality to distinguish or to try and define humanity. She doesn't think that that's a good route to go. She doesn't even know if it's possible. But she wants to just say that this connection between the fetus, the unborn fetus, and the adult is not a good connection. It's a slippery slope.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that is necessarily true. I don't think that we can just say that if we want to conclude that the fetus is a person from the moment of conception, where we're saying the fetus is a human from the moment of conception because it has all the potencies of a human being, she says, well, this conclusion doesn't follow. And she said, it's just like saying it's like the development of an acorn into an oak tree. It doesn't follow that acorns are oak trees. Now, I don't know that that's true. I don't know that that's true.
Yeah.
That is taking a very specific view of the metaphysics of the world, right? And to apply that view to a category of abortion, to say, oh, well, maybe fetuses aren't people or persons, seems to cut against the common sense notion that if you're born from human parents, you're a human person. So what do you think about this idea of potentiality?
Yeah, so the idea of potentiality is that, like you brought up earlier in the discussion in talking about a human being, if you are a human being, to be human is essentially to have all the potentials of humanity. Mm-hmm. So like a human being has all the potentials of what a human being is potential for. And so the idea goes that if an oak tree has a potentiality if an acorn has a potentiality of an oak tree and an acorn isn't an oak tree, then how is it obtaining the potentiality of something that isn't the thing itself?
Right.
Like, for instance, cows don't obtain the potentialities of foxes.
Right.
Like
right.
A cow can never become a fox.
Right. Yeah. And this is exactly why I kind of brought up this idea from Aristotle earlier on, and it's developed a lot. I don't want to say all these ideas came from Aristotle, but at least he's going to say that the argument that he's making is there are two types of being in act and being in potency. And that's what we're talking about when we're talking about a human being, right? We're not just talking about how the being is currently, because it has a lot of potencies that are going to develop if left to its normal development across time. Mm-hmm. And in a way, if we're taking the argument that Thomson is using and we're saying, look, this acorn is at time t, or we'll say t1, right? And the oak tree is t2, and maybe, I don't know how long it takes for an acorn to develop into an oak tree, or where you even want to make that distinction. But I would say the acorn is an oak tree when it's an acorn, right? Because it has being and potency. It has the ways that it will potentially be in its matter. It knows that it's going to develop in a certain way if all else is equal, if left alone, right? Now, if you come along and crush the acorn, obviously that's different. Then you destroy its potencies and its actualities. But there's just this weird way of looking at it, and if you look at it that way, you have the acorn at T1, you have the oak tree at T2, that's just different times. Then you're making time a potentiality, right? You're making time a potential difference. So if we're looking at these distinctions like viability and experience, and you're going to add time, it almost sounds like the experience argument, right? Like there's just the time of development. What does that add? Experience, age. It certainly wouldn't be age. So she says she doesn't want to make these distinctions, right? She doesn't want to. She says, I'm inclined to agree, however, that the prospects for drawing a line in the development of the fetus look dim. And so she's not exactly drawing a line in the development of the fetus, but she is appealing to time. And I don't really see how that's a difference maker for her position.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like it at all. Like, to me, the most basic observation is that an oak tree is simply an acorn that has lived longer or experienced more. So we kind of go back to the experiential argument when we're looking at human beings, like fetuses. All a human being is a more experienced fetus, really, at the end of the day. Like, you experience more nutrients, you experience more time, so you grow, and you experience other people, and you just continue to grow that way, experientially speaking. And just over time, through the obtaining of more nutrients, etc.
Right.
Then your body grows. And that's the exact same thing with an acorn and oak tree. Like, if she's even willing to grant, for example, that a baby, for example, is a human being, like, let's just say outside of the womb, for the sake of argument.
Right.
Well, why can't I make the same argument that babies and old people aren't the same people?
Right.
They're not the same beings, because it's just clear as day that babies and old people just aren't the same. Like, look at the difference in age and experience and everything. Like, babies can't even talk or walk or etc. They can't do anything in society, and Like, we could go on and on and on, but it's obvious, like, even just scientifically speaking, they both have human DNA. An oak tree and an acorn both have the same exact DNA makeup. They both have the same cell breakdown and everything. Like, they're not different they're not different beings. They're the same thing. So
and so and obviously, we're not trying to say, for those who want to nitpick the argument, that if we have acorn 1 and acorn 2 and oak tree 1 and oak tree 2 from acorn 1 and acorn 2, we're not trying to say acorn 2 is the same as oak tree 1, right? There's certainly a connection of material, right? That's what we're trying to get, that the material holds the potencies. And this is Aristotle's position, that matter is potency, and there's something that's informing that matter to develop a certain way, right? And the theological side is going to say, well, that's the soul. Aristotle is going to say that's the form. But we don't have to go that way. We can just ask a humanistic question: how do you determine the humanity of a being, right? And so we have to, when we're saying being, we have to consider both being in act or actuality and being in potency or potency. And so for Aristotle, then, he's going to say we can't make sense of change unless we're talking about change towards some outcome, and that outcome is important, right? And that's what you're talking about, kind of with the child and the older person. The change has to be in the direction of new actualities that are held in the matter, and in this sense, it makes potency a very real thing. It's not, potency isn't nothing, And
Right.
and that's where the connection. That's the connection we're making. That when I read Thomson, it seems like she's dismissing it. Right? She'll even say, opponents of abortion commonly spend most of their time establishing that the fetus is a person, and hardly any time explaining the step from there to the impermissibility of abortion. Well, it seems like you have to dismiss the view that there is such a thing as being in potency, which is a pretty common view across history.
Yeah, because she essentially wants to try and have her cake and eat it too, and say that there's actually certain classes of people, of human beings, that are allowed to be killed.
Mm-hmm.
And then that just creates another slew of problems. Then you have to decide, well, which human beings are allowed to be killed and which ones aren't now. Because now she's just granting, because like if she wants to complain about the argument for how we're saying it's impeccable on the just the sole basis as a human being, a person, etc., it's done. The argument's over. Well, she's like, well, that doesn't necessarily follow. Okay, well, now she's forced to draw another line to say now there's a class of people that are allowed to be murdered and justifiably without any consequence whatsoever.
Right.
And, well, yeah, that just leads to more and more problems.
That leads to some problems.
Yeah. So.
And so I think she ends up saying, it sounds plausible, but now let me ask you to imagine this. And then she gives her famous violinist argument. But I just think the reason it sounds plausible is because it's true, right? Like the reason the argument sounds plausible is because it's true that from conception, you are a human being. Thomson makes the claim later on, right before she gives the violinist argument, which maybe we can talk about in a different video. But she says, okay, well, she's going to grant that the fetus is a person from the moment of conception. And she says, how does the argument go from here? Something like this. Every person has a right to life. So the fetus has a right to life. No doubt the mother has a right to decide what shall happen in and to her body. Everyone would grant that. But surely a person's right to life is stronger and more stringent than the mother's right to decide what happens in and to her body, and so outweighs it. So the fetus may not be killed and abortion may not be performed. And she says, it sounds plausible. And I think that the argument sounds plausible because it's true. Right. And then she gives kind of this very strange violinist analogy. I'm sure most people have heard it. And like I said, we can deal with it in a different video. But that plausibility is there because of the potency we're talking about. If you get rid of that and just say, oh, well, the pro-life people, the anti-abortion people, they just haven't shown their work. They haven't shown how a fetus connects in any way to a person. Well, it's because it's so obvious that oftentimes we don't need to show it, right? But if we want to show it, we're talking about being in potency and being in act. When we say human being, we're not just talking about the being in act as though we're only talking about the material of the zygote or the cells or whatever. We're talking about the potency it might not be as real as what the being in act, but it's still real. It's not nothing. And so when we're considering humanity and human beings, we have to take this into account. And it seems to me she just rejects it outright without any argument.
Yeah, this isn't like super related, but I just think it's funny to comment on it when she says women have the right to do whatever they want to in and to their body. Everyone seems to agree on that. Actually, society doesn't, because we rule things like suicide as illegal, and you're not allowed to inhale methamphetamine. And there's a lot of things, that we're not allowed to do it to our bodies.
She does admit this later on. She says, I should perhaps stop to say explicitly that I'm not claiming that people have a right to do anything whatever to save their lives. And that seems to be at least a little bit of a contradiction to a woman doing whatever they want for their body, to and to their body.
Right, because like in her scenario, can a pregnant woman drink like tons of alcohol and like drown her baby out, like make it retarded and almost kill it? Like, can a pregnant woman do whatever she wants while she's pregnant and like just completely, totally destroy the baby forever?
Right. Yeah,
and that's just totally fine.
Not.
Like,
obviously not.
I don't know.
I mean, she can do it, but everyone would say it's atrocious.
Yeah, like, so it's like society. So like when she says, "See, everyone's society seems to agree." No, we don't. Like, when you actually, it sounds like on the surface, like, oh yeah, people should just be allowed to do whatever they want with their bodies. But legally speaking, and it's been this way historically in the country forever, that we've ruled things like suicide as illegal, which is also just, it is kind of weird. Why, like, attempted suicide is not legal, but suicide is. But
right. That's a different conversation.
Yeah, it's a different conversation.
She does seem to make these assertions. The idea of just getting rid of being in potency, this idea that the woman does have the right to decide what should happen in and to her body, but only to a certain extent, right? So it's like, why would that certain extent include abortion, right? She hasn't really given us a reason. And we could go through the violinist argument, but so many people have done that. The point of this video is just to kind of show you guys, look, there is something called being in potency that does connect humanity to the fetus. And so I think that this is, as Noonan would say from the article that we were referencing, it's an absolute value in history, right? We've always thought of human beings as human beings because they have the human potential as derived from their parents. So it sounds plausible because it is plausible.
And the last thing, like, I would want to say to that whole point too is, like, Ben Shapiro makes this argument, and I think it's worth bringing up, that you're using your body when you stab somebody, right? It's your body, your choice. You can choose what you want to do with it. So let's take this scenario. If she wants to make the point, like, well, yeah, but the fetus is completely dependent upon her to survive. Then we go back to the viability argument, right? That we did at the beginning of the video. So now it's like, okay, so can women stab their babies, their 1 month-old babies, because they're annoying them too much and they just don't want to take care of them anymore? Right. They're too taxing on them because it's just too much to handle.
Right.
So what stops the woman from killing the baby at that point than when the fetus is in the womb? You get all sorts of problems when you try to make the whole my body, my choice, because the woman's having to use her body to take care of 1 month-old. It can't survive on its own. So can the woman decide to kill it at that point too? Like, and I don't think the author wants to concede that.
No, yeah, the author certainly wouldn't want to. And, to be fair, she does admit that the scope of her paper is pretty restricted, which is funny when you hear people talk about how great this paper is. You hear pro-choice people talk about this paper and the violinist argument. They never talk about how Thomson limits her argument to essentially cases of rape and maybe even less than that. So we're talking about less than 1% of the cases of abortion. And so, we can have that argument. We can do maybe a different video on those 1% or less cases. But I think for now, we'll leave that to a different video. And maybe the last thing I want to say is this being in potency argument, where we're talking about potency being a real thing. It really does apply to her violinist argument in the sense of potency is a natural thing, right? You get this naturally from your parents. The human potential is something that's passed down through conception, through a natural act. And so the violinist argument is very unnatural. I think there are different rules and regulations and laws, and even a different set of principles we'd apply to an unnatural situation like that versus a natural situation that has these potencies, this being in potency that comes with it. What we've tried to do in this video is bring up a question relating to the topic of, or the debate on abortion. And that question was, how do you determine the humanity of a being? We tried to put this in humanistic terms so that the question became a question about potentialities, right? And so do we refuse to discriminate among human beings on the basis of varying potentialities? And we looked at two different potentialities. One was viability, or one distinction was viability, one distinction was experience. And then we looked at Thomson and said, or Thomson's article, and she says, well, I'm not going to try and make any distinctions on, or I'm not going to try to draw a line in the development of the fetus or make a distinction in potentiality. Instead, what she does is she's trying to show that the conclusion does not follow from the pro-life perspective, right? The idea that the fetus is actually a human person. And we argued against this by looking at Aristotle's being and potency concept and saying potencies are actually real, and this is a natural aspect of the world that's and we have this natural potency as a result of conception, so that the answer is fairly simple, right? Even Thomson says it sounds plausible, and our argument is that it sounds plausible because it's true, right? If you have human parents, then you are a human person because you have the human potential. And just as an acorn is in one sense an oak tree in potency, a fetus is a person and a human person in the sense of being in potency. And we would argue being in act too. But if we're taking the whole being together, being in act, being in potency, we certainly can draw a line from the fetus to the adult and call both of them humans and persons.
Yeah, so the next video, we're going to be kind of diving into the U.S. Constitution a little bit and just some of the legal challenges against abortion and also specifically Roe v. Wade. Is it constitutional? Is it something that really fits within the American legal system? Because we kind of did our philosophical attack and defense against abortion in this video. So we kind of just want to see the relationship between the philosophy and the legal side, and just make a strong case for the pro-life position. You know, recently, like the heartbeat bill came out, got passed in South Carolina, which is really great. Praise God for that. Yeah. So, you know, anything that we can do to, like, you know, advance the conversation more and more to see this happen more, like, that'd be great. So any more suggestions on the topic of abortion that you'd like us to talk about, just leave in the comments and be more than happy to do it.
All right. Thanks, guys, and stay tuned for